There's an interview going on here. Jock, there's an interview situation developing. Why don't you just tell me to fuck off then?
Why don't you fuck off?
What? Don't be rude.
So you were saying in the afternoon that you were editing something.
I know.
Are you working on some video material or?
No. I knew you'd be confused by that. No, I'm editing musical scores. So it's music that I've written that's been kind of printed for the first time, and I'm just kind of editing in the way that you would edit kind of written text. So I'm sort of changing things, changing the orchestration, correcting mistakes and making new choices about who plays what, and looking at it and thinking, well, there's a trumpet playing here, the trumpet's been playing for too long, maybe saxophone could play the trumpet. So all those kind of decisions which eventually end up on stage, that's kind of what I'm working on. It's something nice to do because it's sort of creative but doesn't need me to be too creative. So I don't need to create anything, but it's part of the process. Because writing a piece of music, there are a lot of kind of different operations in writing a piece of music, and one of the operations I enjoy most is this question of editing and correcting, and it's not editing in the sense of video editing, because the nice thing about working with video, as you'll see from some of the films, is you take material and you can sort of change the relationship between shots, and with Nyman, with a movie camera, you can constantly use material in a different way. You constantly replace one shot with another, and if you saw kind of 10 different versions of Nyman with a movie camera, you would see that I'm constantly sort of upgrading the material. So every time I go somewhere and I find a better image of a mode of transport, or a better image of a wedding or a divorce or something, then I kind of film it and put it into the film. But musical editing is non-creative. The editing process with music is when you're writing. So it's a bit like that sentence, You've done the editing in writing the sentence, and you don't kind of cut it up. And
so how did you start? You haven't been doing films since.
Well, no, I made a film in the late 60s. When I first got to know Peter Greenaway, we both had kind of 16mm Bolex cameras, and we wandered around London making 16mm films, or rather I shot a lot of 16mm material. And it's kind of interesting parallel to the last kind of 10 or 15 years. I just shot stuff. We shot anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, or we shot this or that or whatever. And I just collected all this material, didn't do anything with it. And then one day Peter said to me, I think you should discipline yourself to making a film. And I said, oh God, how do I do that? And he said, let's take one event, we'll go and shoot that event, and then we'll edit that afternoon's material. So I went to a demonstration at a legalized pot rally at Hyde Park at Marble Arch Speaker's Corner in the summer of '67, hippie time. And I shot this material, gave it to Peter Greenaway, selected the soundtrack to edit the film to, which was the Beatles' All You Need Is Love, and Peter Greenaway edited this film. Nobody knows he did it, there are no credits. And there are one or two shots that I've taken. You'll see one or two black and white shots that I've taken from this film, which is called Love, 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 that I use in Nyman with a movie camera. So, during the 80s and 90s, I had different format video cameras, VHS, high 8, DV, HD, whatever. So over the last 20 years, I've shot material, I've collected material, collected footage, captured events, and got home, put it in a drawer, gone out, come to somewhere like this, or studio in Moscow, or in a fruit and vegetable market in St. Petersburg, or in Iran, or wherever I happen to be, and I've shot material for no particular purpose except I'm there, I have a camera, it interests me, I capture it, no purpose to be a filmmaker. And then 6-7 years ago I saw, like, in a drawer 70 or 80 little mini DV tapes, and I thought, when I die, nobody's going to be interested in looking at these. Why don't I look at them, see if there's any interesting material? So two young friends of mine were filmmakers, and we looked at all this material, and they thought that some of it was amazing, not only the subject matter, but also the way that, I have a particular kind of eye, I have a particular kind of, I don't know, I can't describe what I do. I know what I do when I do it. So they said, okay, well, let's take this footage and let's turn it into a film. So we made about 15 films out of this material, mostly kind of single subject films. So they're little kind of studies, they're little case studies, they're essays, they're kind of fluxus events. And then I thought, okay, my filmmaking career ends when we have exhausted this raw material that I happen to have collected. I will never make a film. And then I found myself going out on the street and more self-consciously filming something with a view to it becoming a film within this kind of canon of films that I'd sort of started making. So now I consciously do two things. One thing is I collect footage to put into constantly remaking Nyman with a movie camera, and then I create these individual films with a kind of given subject. And what you'll see tonight, and this is like only the second time we've done this, is to show 5 short films, the material of which also spills over into Nyman with a movie camera. So I'm sort of constantly plagiarizing myself, which is what I do as a composer anyway. So I sort of try to make as much much distinction between being a filmmaker and a composer, but in fact there are differences and there are similarities in the process.
And how does the music affect the film, and vice versa as well?
Well, that's something that you'll have to tell me. I never make these films with a view to being a composer of soundtracks. I'm kind of aware that when we sit down and start editing, that some material works better with a soundtrack, and the soundtrack can be used for different purposes, as a structuring device, as a kind of emotional confusion device, as a device that does the opposite of emotional confusion, an emotional discipline, or there's a way of editing the material to a piece of music that already has its own structure. Because when I put a musical soundtrack to these films, it's always a soundtrack that already exists. So I would never sit down and write a soundtrack for any of my films. I've got a kind of huge amount of recorded music, and the process is I sit down with Max, my editor, we decide that we need a soundtrack, and I say, okay, iTunes library, this track is going to be perfect, and it always is. And that decision takes 30 seconds, maybe 60 seconds, which contrasts rather severely with the process of writing soundtracks, writing new soundtracks to the films made by other filmmakers, which can sometimes take weeks or months or never. Sometimes you spend months on a soundtrack and the director finds it unsuitable and say, thank you, goodbye, fuck off, finding another composer. And I say, thank you, goodbye, fuck off, I'm finding another film to use the same music that you've just rejected. And that's one of the great things about my process of being a composer and a filmmaker, is this whole kind of recycling. So with the first 5 films, the material has a very kind of specific, the visual material has very specific structural and has a very important role in the film. But as I say, the usage of that same material in the second film, in Nyman with a movie camera, is much more loose, much more elusive, much more, I'm sort of creating a dialogue between sources of material from a lot of different viewpoints, but you as a member of the audience would see the footage of a bullfight that I shot in Mexico City. You'll see that in a very different context with a different set of relationships in Nyman with a movie camera, and since Nyman with a movie camera, every image is related to the Vertov images in Man with a movie camera. These images define themselves in relation to Vertov rather than in relation to Nyman, but they also redefine themselves in relation to each other in a totally different context. But I think you have to see the film.
I have one more question about the film. I didn't see much, but from what I saw, there is a lot of layering, a lot of times, and also
sometimes. Okay, there are different methods. Sometimes the film is simply one shot. I go out in the street, I shoot something. Editing consists only of adding a title and finding a start point and an end point. At other times there is, as you say, a lot of layering. There's a lot of conventional editing, but there's a kind of layering process whereby, the second film is called, no, wait a minute, it's the third film, is called Witness 2, where there are 2 sets of images from 2 totally different sources, happen to be physically in the same space, but 2 totally different sources, and I've merged them, superimposed, I've allowed. Yeah, what's interesting is that I'm not particularly interested in kind of video tricks or video art or whatever, but I find myself, when I'm editing with Max, talking much more about dissolves and fades and layering and superimposition and doing kind of clever things that suit the material that I wouldn't ever have expected to do. And also in the last film called Knowing the Ropes, there's a lot of kind of speeding up and slowing down of.
This is not the film that is about Lorca.
No, that's something else.
Because there is as well.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
So, but they are waiting for you there 1 minute. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.